July 1944, somewhere on a small Pacific island. The rain has finally stopped. The jungle exhales. Smoke hangs low over broken palm trees and shallow craters filled with seawater and blood. The battle is over, but no one celebrates. In a shell hole near the beach, a Japanese soldier lies motionless, his rifle discarded, his uniform torn and stiff with sweat. 4 days. He has been told this moment must never come. Capture is not survival, it is erasure. Shame that follows the family name forever. Worse than death, he has been taught, is what the enemy will do next. He waits for the blow, for the bayonet, for the rope. Instead, there are boots in the mud, voices in a language he barely understands, a canteen pressed into his hand, hands that search for weapons, not to torture, but to disarm. No shouting, no execution. The fear does not leave him, it deepens, because nothing in his training prepared him for this silence. And as he is led away from the battlefield, toward a place he was told no Japanese soldier ever returns from, the war he believed he understood begins to quietly fall apart one step at a time. The world that shaped the expectation by the time the Pacific War entered its 3rd year. The battlefield was only the final layer of a much deeper conflict. Long before the first shot was fired on the beaches of the Philippines or the jungles of Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers had already been prepared for captivity, not as a temporary condition, but as a fate worse than death. This conditioning began well before enlistment. In pre-war Japan, military service was not simply a duty, it was a moral transformation. The Imperial Japanese Army drew heavily from a modernized interpretation of Bushido, the warrior ethic once associated with the samurai class. In its wartime form, Bushido emphasized absolute loyalty, self-sacrifice, and the total rejection of surrender. To be captured was not misfortune, it was a moral failure. Army field manuals reinforced this view in blunt language. Soldiers were taught that death in battle was honorable, but survival through surrender was a betrayal to the emperor, to the unit, and to the family at home. This belief was not symbolic, it was enforced. Men who surrendered were often officially listed as dead, their families informed that they had fallen in service, not survived in shame. By the late 1930s, this ideology had become inseparable from military training. Recruits were routinely subjected to harsh discipline, designed to break individual identity and replace it with unquestioning obedience. Beatings were common, hunger was instructional, survival itself was framed as entrance through suffering. In this environment, cruelty was not an exception, it was a tool. These experiences shaped how Japanese soldiers imagined the enemy. Western armies, they were told, were decadent, soft, incapable of endurance. At the same time, Westerners were portrayed as morally inferior, prone to sadism and racial hatred. If captured by such an enemy, Japanese soldiers were warned they would be tortured for information, humiliated for sport, or executed outright. Instructors did not need evidence. The belief was repeated until it became fact. The war in China reinforced these assumptions. Beginning in 1937, Japanese forces operated in an environment where surrender was rare and brutality was normalized. Prisoners, when taken, were often treated as expendable. This reality did not remain isolated to the battlefield. It became internalized as expectation. If this was how war was fought, then surely the enemy would behave the same or worse. When Japan expanded into the Pacific after December 1941, these beliefs followed every soldier onto every transport ship and landing craft. In the early victories against Western colonial forces, the idea of capture seemed remote. Japanese units advanced rapidly through Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. Surrender was something the enemy did. But by mid-1942, the strategic balance began to shift. Battles like Midway and Guadalcanal signaled that the war would not be short. As American forces pushed back across the Pacific, Japanese garrisons found themselves increasingly isolated. Supply lines thinned. Reinforcements failed to arrive. Disease and starvation became as lethal as enemy fire. Still, surrender remained unthinkable. Entire units fought until annihilation. Wounded soldiers dragged themselves into the jungle to die alone rather than risk capture. Suicide charges became routine, not out of tactical necessity, but moral obligation. Those who did survive battle and fall into enemy hands often did so unconscious, wounded, or physically incapable of resistance. They arrived at captivity already convinced they had entered a world of punishment. They did not expect food. They did not expect medical care. They expected revenge. And as American forces began to collect prisoners, often surprised to find any alive at all, two entirely different visions of warfare were about to collide. Not on the battlefield, but behind the wire. That collision would not be immediate. It would unfold slowly, camp by camp, moment by moment, as assumptions hardened over years met a reality one had prepared them for. The system they entered asterisk, while Japanese soldiers were taught to expect cruelty in captivity. The system waiting for them on the other side of the battlefield had been built on an entirely different foundation, one shaped not by honor codes or racial myth, but by law, bureaucracy, and precedent. The United States entered the Pacific War with a long institutional memory of prisoner handling. American military doctrine treated captivity as moral failure, but as a logistical condition of war. By 1941, U.S. forces were trained under regulations derived from the Geneva Convention, which governed the treatment of prisoners of war. Although Japan had signed, but not ratified the convention, American policy applied its standards regardless of reciprocity. This approach was neither sentimental nor idealistic. It was procedural. Prisoners were to be disarmed, searched, registered, and transported. They were to be fed according to ration scales. Medical care was mandatory, not optional. Abuse was punishable. These rules were reinforced through military police training and command oversight. Violations were investigated. Guards were reminded that prisoners were no longer combatants. Yet early encounters in the Pacific revealed how unprepared both sides were for each other. American troops, particularly Marines on Guadalcanal and later islands, often found Japanese resistance fanatical and incomprehensible. Soldiers who charged machine guns or refused to surrender, even when wounded, contradicted every expectation formed from earlier wars in Europe. This confusion ran both ways. When Japanese soldiers were captured, often dazed, wounded, or starving, they expected immediate execution. Many were shocked simply to be kept alive. Some resisted medical treatment, convinced it was a prelude to torture. Others refused food, believing it poisoned or conditional. American units initially struggled to manage these prisoners. Language barriers were severe. Interpreters were scarce. Cultural assumptions filled the gaps. Some U.S. soldiers, hardened by combat and aware of Japanese atrocities elsewhere, viewed prisoners with suspicion or resentment. Isolated incidents of mistreatment did occur, particularly early in the war, and the U.S. military acknowledged and prosecuted several cases. But institutionally, the system moved in the opposite direction. As the number of captives increased from dozens to thousands, dedicated prisoner of war compounds were established across the Pacific and later in the continental United States. Camps in Hawaii, Australia, and the American mainland followed standardized layouts. Barracks replaced cages, wire replaced jungle. Food became the first point of psychological rupture. Rations were based on American military standards, often exceeding what Japanese soldiers had received in the field for months. Rice was supplemented with bread, meat, vegetables, and coffee. For many prisoners, the sudden availability of calories caused illness, not from poison, but from bodies no longer adapted to nourishment. Medical treatment deepened the shock. American doctors treated enemy wounded alongside their own, following triage rather than nationality. Japanese prisoners received surgeries, antibiotics, and recovery time. Red Cross inspections documented conditions. Death rates in American-run camps were low, dramatically lower than in Japanese camps, holding Allied prisoners. This reality collided violently with what Japanese soldiers had been taught. The expected arc of captivity, interrogation, torture, execution failed to materialize. Instead came paperwork, roll calls, work details, predictable routines. Yet suspicion did not fade quickly. Many prisoners believed the kindness was temporary. Others assumed it was a manipulation designed to extract information. Silence became a defense. Officers often tried to maintain discipline, enforcing Japanese hierarchy inside the camps, even as their authority eroded over time. However, the structure itself began to speak louder than propaganda. Days passed without punishment. Weeks passed without abuse. Some prisoners were allowed to write letters. Others attended classes or worked in kitchens and workshops. The enemy, it seemed, operated according to rules. This did not erase fear. It transformed it. The terror of physical torture gave way to something more disorienting, the realization that everything they had been promised about capture was wrong. And as months of captivity stretched into years, the battlefield ideology that had once governed every decision began to weaken, not through argument or persuasion, but through lived experience, quiet, repetitive, undeniable. That slow unraveling would become the core of the prisoner experience, shaping how individuals adapted, resisted, and ultimately redefined survival itself. Inside the wire the human shock for the individual Japanese soldier. Captivity began as a psychological free fall. The moment of surrender did not bring relief. It produced paralysis. Men who had been trained to expect immediate execution instead found themselves alive, fed, and medically treated. This contradiction was not comforting. It was destabilizing. Many prisoners reported an inability to sleep during their first weeks in custody. They waited for punishment that never arrived. Some flinched at the sound of footsteps, convinced each inspection would end in violence. Others isolated themselves, refusing to speak or make eye contact. Survival, once defined as entrance through suffering, had lost its meaning. Shame compounded the fear. Japanese culture placed enormous weight on social obligation. Prisoners believed they had disgraced their families and ancestors. Some assumed they had been officially declared dead at home. To accept food or kindness from the enemy felt like a second betrayal. Suicide attempts, though rare in American camps compared to the battlefield, did occur, often in the early phase of captivity. What unsettled many prisoners most was the absence of cruelty. Pain had been expected. It had been prepared for. Order and routine had not. The quiet predictability of camp life forced prisoners to confront not only their enemy, but themselves, alive, defeated, and uncertain of who they were without the war to define them. That internal conflict would shape every interaction that followed. Culture against reality. Imperial Japanese military culture had taught that discipline was maintained through fear. In American camps, discipline came through regulation. Orders were written, rules were posted, punishments were procedural, not arbitrary. For many prisoners, this difference was profound. The concept of equal treatment under rules applied regardless of rank or background clashed with a worldview built on hierarchy and unquestioned authority. Japanese officers attempted to preserve traditional command structures within the camps, but their power was limited. American guards recognized rank, but did not defer to it. Authority belonged to the camp administration, not the senior prisoner. This eroded long-held assumptions about strength and control. In the Japanese system, power flowed downward through intimidation. In the American system, it flowed impersonally through bureaucracy. The effect was subtle but persistent. Prisoners began to realize that compliance did not require humiliation, and obedience did not require violence. Cultural rituals also faded. Military drills lost purpose. Slogans repeated quietly held less force when unreinforced by punishment. Over time, daily routines, meals, work details, medical checks replaced ideological reinforcement. The culture that had defined honor through death now existed in a place where survival was ordinary and expected. That contradiction was impossible to ignore ***, seeing the enemy * before capture. American soldiers had existed in Japanese imagination as caricatures brutal, undisciplined, morally corrupt. In captivity, that image fractured. Guards varied. Some were indifferent, some were curious. A few were openly hostile, especially early in the war, but systematic cruelty was absent. Many guards were young men themselves, far from home, performing assigned duties. They followed rules. They enforced schedules. They handed out food and counted heads. This ordinariness unsettled prisoners more than violence would have. The enemy was not a monster. He was a clerk with a rifle, a medic with a clipboard, a cook serving rations. Conversations, when they occurred through interpreters, further eroded stereotypes. Some prisoners learned that their guards had lost friends in the same battles. Others learned that American soldiers had little understanding of Japanese ideology, seeing their enemy as disciplined but tragic. The war, once framed as a clash of moral absolutes, began to look like something else larger, impersonal, and indifferent to the beliefs of the men trapped inside it. The American Guard perspective * for American personnel. Guarding Japanese prisoners was not a role most had anticipated. Training emphasized security and compliance, but cultural understanding was minimal. Early encounters were marked by mistrust. Guards had been warned that prisoners might feign surrender to attack. Over time, patterns emerged. Japanese prisoners were generally compliant, often overly so. Many avoided eye contact. Some refused to speak even when addressed. This behavior was initially misread as defiance, when it was often shame. American guards operated under constant instruction to avoid mistreatment. Commanders understood the strategic value of humane treatment not only for intelligence, but for post-war accountability. Discipline among guards was enforced. Abuse reflected poorly on leadership. As camp stabilized, guarding became routine. The emotional distance remained, but the relationship was no longer defined by fear. Prisoners were enemies, but controlled ones, alive ones. And within this controlled environment, something unexpected began to happen. Not reconciliation, but recognition. The prisoners were not demons. They were soldiers who had believed the same lies in reverse. That realization marked the beginning of a deeper transformation, one that would unfold not through confrontation, but through time. ***, what changed them? Structure, food, and medicine. ***, the physical structure of American-run prisoner of war camps played a decisive role reshaping perception. These were not improvisations, they were systems. Barbed wire defined boundaries, but inside those boundaries were schedules, kitchens, infirmaries, and supply depots. Order was not symbolic, it was operational. Food arrived on time, not always in abundance, but consistently. For soldiers who had survived months on starvation rations, sometimes less than 1,000 calories a day, the reliability of meals became a quiet revelation. Weight returned, strength followed. For some, the simple act of eating without fear was unsettling. Medical care accelerated the transformation. Wounds that would have festered in the jungle were cleaned and treated. Diseases like malaria, dysentery, and beriberi were addressed systematically. Prisoners were vaccinated, quarantined when necessary, released when recovered. This care was not framed as mercy. It was routine, and that routine stripped away the narrative of deliberate cruelty that these soldiers had been taught to expect. The system did not reward obedience with kindness. It applied treatment as a matter of policy, for men conditioned to associate authority with suffering. This impersonality was difficult to process, yet over time, the body responded before the mind. Health improved, fatigue lifted, and with physical stability came the first space for reflection. The psychological fracture. The most significant rupture in captivity was not physical, it was cognitive. Japanese prisoners carried with them an image of the world that could not survive prolonged exposure to reality. Many initially believed the humane treatment was a temporary phase of preparation for interrogation or execution. Weeks passed, then months. Nothing changed. The anticipated violence never arrived. This forced a reassessment that was deeply painful. If the enemy was not cruel by nature, then the certainty of Japanese wartime instruction came into question. If surrender did not lead to torture, then the logic of death over capture weakened. Some prisoners reacted with anger. Others withdrew further into silence. A few openly questioned the ideology they had been raised with, though such discussions were often confined to private moments, away from officers who still enforced traditional norms. The fracture was not ideological rebellion. It was exhaustion. Maintaining belief required effort. Reality required none. Over time, the daily evidence accumulated until denial became impossible. This did not create admiration for the enemy. It created confusion, and confusion, once introduced, could not be undone. Leadership in captivity *. Japanese officers faced a unique crisis inside the camps. Their authority depended on a belief system that captivity undermined. Without the battlefield, without the emperor's presence, without the threat of death, rank lost its coercive power. Some officers attempted to enforce discipline through informal punishment, ostracism, or moral pressure. These efforts were often curtailed by camp authorities, who prohibited internal abuse. American administrators monitored camp dynamics closely, aware that hierarchy could become a source of violence. As a result, leadership fractured. Some officers adapted, focusing on maintaining order and morale within the limits imposed. Others retreated into isolation, unable to reconcile their role with the reality of defeat. For enlisted men, this shift was subtle but significant. Authority no longer felt absolute. The rigid chain of command softened. Individual survival replaced collective sacrifice. This erosion of hierarchy did not produce rebellion. It produced space to think, to observe, and to endure captivity without constant ideological reinforcement. The unavoidable comparison, perhaps the most destabilizing angle, emerged from comparison. Japanese prisoners gradually learned about the conditions faced by Allied prisoners in Japanese camps through Red Cross reports, translated newspapers, and conversations with interpreters. Fragments of information reached them about forced labor, starvation, and high mortality rates. These accounts were difficult to absorb. They contradicted not only propaganda, but national self-image. For some prisoners, the knowledge produced shame. For others, disbelief. A few rejected the information outright, but the comparison lingered. It reshaped how captivity was understood, not as a universal experience of suffering, but as a reflection of systems and choices. The realization was not immediate. It unfolded slowly, painfully, as evidence accumulated. The enemy's restraint highlighted the brutality they had been taught to accept as normal. By the time this awareness settled in, captivity had already ceased to feel temporary. It had become a different kind of war, one fought internally, without weapons, against beliefs that could no longer sustain themselves. And as this internal conflict deepened, the decisive turning point approached, not marked by a battle or explosion, but by a quiet moment of acceptance that nothing would ever return to what it had been before. Shall I continue to the climax? Turning point, Section 1. When expectation finally collapsed, the decisive moment for many Japanese prisoners did not arrive with a single event. There was no announcement, no confrontation, no revelation delivered in words. Instead, the turning point emerged quietly, after months of waiting for something that never came. For some, it happened in the infirmary. A wound that should have meant death healed instead. Bandages were changed daily. Pain was managed. Recovery was expected. The logic was impossible to ignore. Torture did not require this level of care. For others, the moment came during inspection visits by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Neutral observers walked through the camps, spoke with prisoners, examined records, and left again. Nothing changed afterward. No punishment followed. The presence of an outside authority confirmed that captivity was not hidden, improvised, or lawless. It was visible, accountable. Food distribution became another anchor of realization. Meals were repetitive, sometimes bland, but consistent. There was no bargaining attached. No information demanded in exchange. Men who had expected starvation as a tool of control instead found themselves regulated by calorie counts and supply schedules. This constancy began to erode the last defenses of belief. The fear that had sustained resistance, fear of torture, fear of humiliation, lost its purpose. What replaced it was not comfort, but clarity. The enemy was not waiting to punish them. The war, at least in this place, was already over. That understanding arrived unevenly. Some prisoners reached it quickly, others resisted 4 years. But once the realization settled, it changed the nature of captivity entirely. Survival was no longer an act of defiance. It was simply existence. Interrogations, when they occurred, further reinforced the shift. Questioning was structured. Interpreters translated calmly. Refusal to answer did not result in violence. Prisoners who had been told interrogation meant agony now encountered patience and, often, disinterest. Intelligence officers already knew much of what could be learned. The war was larger than any single soldier. This indifference was unsettling. It suggested that their suffering, once imagined as central to the enemy's purpose, was in fact peripheral. They were prisoners not because they were hated, but because the system required containment. For many Japanese soldiers, this was the true breaking point. The war they had prepared for, a war of annihilation, honor, and vengeance, did not exist here. What existed instead was time. Long days, repeated routines, space to think. Some prisoners began to talk among themselves, cautiously at first. They compared expectations with reality. They revisited training slogans that no longer fit. The language of absolute loyalty weakened when unreinforced by fear. This did not lead to immediate ideological rejection. Many still believed in the emperor. Many still felt shame. But belief no longer operated under pressure. It became something quieter, more fragile. The camps did not re-educate through force. They allowed disillusionment to occur naturally. And once that process began, it could not be reversed. As the months passed and news of Allied advances filtered in, captivity ceased to feel like a pause between battles. It became a destination, a place where the war's meaning was quietly dismantled, not by argument, but by lived contradiction. That dismantling would reach its deepest point as the war itself approached its end, and prisoners were forced to confront not just the enemy's system, but the fate of the world they would one day return to. Acceptance without victory. As the war entered its final phase, the rhythm of captivity changed. The camps did not become harsher, they became quieter. News arrived in fragments, maps pinned to bulletin boards, translated summaries of radio broadcasts, guarded conversations among administrators. The front lines were moving. Japan was retreating. For Japanese prisoners, this information carried a different weight. Victory had once been assumed. Defeat had been unthinkable. Now it hovered in the background of every day, unspoken but present. American camp authorities allowed limited access to newspapers and educational materials, particularly after 1944. The intention was practical, not ideological. Informed prisoners were easier to manage, but the effect was profound. For the first time, many Japanese soldiers encountered information filtered through imperial propaganda. They read about the bombing of cities, about lost islands, about Allied landings drawing closer to the Japanese mainland. Some refused to believe it. Others accepted it slowly, as details accumulated consistently to dismiss. The realization that the war might be lost did not produce immediate grief. It produced numbness. For men who had expected to die in battle, survival into defeat felt directionless. There was no script for this outcome. Work programs became a focal point. Prisoners were assigned to labor kitchen duty, maintenance, farming, manufacturing under supervision, and within regulations. These tasks were not punitive. They were designed to occupy time and contribute to camp function. For many prisoners, work became grounding. It restored a sense of purpose unrelated to combat. This, too, was destabilizing. Identity had been built around soldiering. Now usefulness existed without violence. Interpersonal dynamics shifted. Conversations grew longer. Silence became less defensive. Some prisoners learned basic English. A few guards learned Japanese phrases. These exchanges were limited, cautious, and never friendly, but they were human. The final collapse of expectation often came with the confirmation of Japan's surrender in August 1945. The announcement was delivered formally, translated clearly, and repeated to ensure understanding. There was no celebration, no retaliation. The war simply ended. For Japanese prisoners, the moment was surreal. They had survived the unthinkable capture, imprisonment, defeat. The fear of torture that had once defined their future had never materialized. Instead, they faced an entirely different uncertainty: return. What awaited them in Japan was unknown. Would they be accepted? Would they be punished? Would their survival be seen as shame or resilience? The camps could not answer these questions. In the weeks that followed, routines continued. Food was served. Medical care persisted. Preparations for repatriation began. The enemy did not transform into a liberator. It remained an administrator of process. Acceptance settled not as relief, but as quiet entrance. The prisoners did not emerge victorious. They emerged changed. The war they had internalized had been dismantled piece by piece, not by force, but by contradiction. As transports were prepared and names were called, many prisoners left the camps carrying no physical scars, but bearing an internal reckoning that would follow them long after the barbed wire disappeared. That reckoning would define the aftermath, not just for individuals, but for a nation forced to confront what captivity, survival, and defeat truly meant. Returning to a country that had already moved on repatriation began slowly. Ships were allocated. Lists were verified. Medical checks were repeated. For Japanese prisoners, the journey home did not feel like release. It felt like crossing into uncertainty without preparation. By late 1945 and early 1946, thousands of former prisoners were transported back to a Japan that no longer resembled the country they had left. Cities lay in ruins. Infrastructure was shattered. Authority had changed hands. The emperor had spoken publicly, not as a divine figure, but as a human one. The war had ended not with triumph, but with capitulation. Under the administration of the Allied occupation, led by Douglas MacArthur, Japan entered a period of enforced demilitarization and reconstruction. For returning prisoners, this transformation intensified their dislocation. They had been absent not only from the final battles, but from the collapse of the ideology that had defined their service. Many returned to families who believed them dead. Others arrived to silence. In communities shaped by wartime sacrifice, survival through capture was often met with discomfort. Former prisoners rarely spoke of their experiences. Shame lingered, reinforced by years of indoctrination that no official policy could immediately erase. The Japanese government, overwhelmed by post-war crisis, offered limited support. Records were incomplete. Reintegration was largely informal. Some former prisoners concealed their past. Others struggled to reconcile the reality of humane captivity with a society still processing defeat. Official statistics revealed the contrast clearly. Mortality rates among Japanese POWs held by the United States were dramatically lower than those of Allied POWs held by Japan. These numbers circulated quietly in reports, not widely discussed in public. They challenged national narratives at a moment when cohesion felt fragile. For many former prisoners, the most difficult adjustment was internal. They had survived not by dying honorably, but by enduring. The American camps had dismantled the belief that surrender equaled moral extinction. Japan, however, had not yet fully absorbed that lesson. Work became a refuge. Silence became common. The war, for them, did not end with surrender. It followed them home, reshaped into questions they were rarely asked aloud. Yet these individual experiences, fragmented and unspoken, formed part of a broader historical shift, one that would take years to surface, but would ultimately influence how Japan remembered the war itself. The quiet weight of evidence eased, the immediate crisis of post-war survival eased. A longer process began, one driven not by declarations, but by documentation. Reports were compiled, archives opened. The experience of prisoners of war, once peripheral to public memory, became increasingly difficult to ignore. Allied occupation authorities collected extensive records on captivity conditions across theaters. Medical logs, inspection reports, and correspondence from neutral observers painted a consistent picture of American-run POW camps. Mortality was low. Malnutrition was addressed. Abuse, when it occurred, was investigated. These findings did not circulate widely among the public at first, but they were known to policymakers, historians, and veterans. For former Japanese prisoners, this documentation provided a strange form of validation. What they had lived often in silence was no longer anecdotal. It was verifiable. Their survival was not an exception. It was the result of a system. Comparisons became unavoidable. As evidence of Allied POW suffering in Japanese camps emerged through survivor testimonies, war crimes trials, and international reporting, the contrast sharpened. The difference was not one of individual cruelty alone. It was institutional. One system had normalized brutality as discipline. The other had constrained behavior through regulation and oversight. This realization was painful. It implicated training, command culture, and national myth. For a society rebuilding itself on pacifist foundations, the prisoner experience became a quiet reference point, a reminder of how ideology could deform behavior when unchecked. Former prisoners rarely became public figures. Few wrote memoirs in the immediate post-war decades. When they did speak, it was often cautiously, emphasizing survival rather than judgment. Their stories complicated simple narratives of heroism and victimhood. Yet over time, those stories influenced scholarship. Historians began to examine captivity not only as a humanitarian issue, but as a psychological one. How belief systems endure or collapse under pressure. How exposure to alternative models of authority can reshape identity without coercion. By the late 20th century, the experience of Japanese POWs held by the United States had become part of a broader reassessment of the Pacific War, not as a story of kindness overcoming hatred, but as evidence that systems matter, that rules shape outcomes, that expectations, when contradicted by reality, can alter lives more deeply than violence ever could. The aftermath of captivity did not resolve neatly. It settled into memory unevenly, carried by individuals rather than institutions. But its implications extended beyond any single camp or nation. They pointed toward a larger truth, one that would only fully emerge with time and distance. The story of Japanese prisoners in American camps is not a story of mercy conquering cruelty. It is a story of assumptions colliding with systems and losing. These soldiers entered captivity expecting torture because they had been taught that power expresses itself through suffering. What they encountered instead was bureaucracy, schedules, medical charts, ration lists, an enemy constrained by rules rather than driven by vengeance. That difference did not erase fear. It dismantled it slowly, not through persuasion, but through repetition. Each day without punishment weakened a belief that had once felt absolute. Each act of routine care undermined a worldview built on inevitability. In war, violence is loud. Its consequences are immediate, but the most profound transformations often occur quietly, when expectations fail and certainty dissolves. For many Japanese prisoners, captivity became the place where the war they had internalized finally ended, not with death, but with contradiction. This experience did not absolve responsibility. It did not undo suffering elsewhere. It did not reconcile all wounds. But it revealed something essential about modern warfare. That treatment of the defeated reflects not the enemy's worth, but a system's values. The Pacific War was defined by extremes, fanaticism, and firepower, sacrifice and annihilation. Yet within that landscape existed spaces governed by restraint. Those spaces did not change the outcome of the war. They changed how it was understood. For the men who survived captivity, the memory endured as dissonance, a reminder that the world was larger and more complex than the truths they had been given. For history, it stands as evidence that even in total war, structure can limit cruelty, and expectation is never destiny. And in that quiet space between belief and reality, a different civilization briefly revealed itself not as an ideal, but as a possibility,